Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. Today we continue to work on our card/colony survival hybrid game called Hand of Life. Now last time we added a class system to our game to differentiate our colonists, and we also started working on the basics for a menu system. And today we're going to be tackling a monster and figuring out how to manage a large number of instances at once. We'll be doing this by trying to create a global data system. This system will need to be able to add, remove, and modify data for, theoretically, a lot of objects in our game. This is a big, tough order, so let's get to it. First thing I did was add a couple global variables for a building count and the building data grid to the game. I originally went with structures, but building ended up being faster for me to type, so I switched to buildings later on. Anyway, I'm gonna stop right here and explain our goal before we go any further. So while working on the Pikmin prototype, I learned that GameMaker really doesn't do well with large amounts of active instances. This means we have to be very careful with how we populate our game. And while the general rule of thumb is to usually never worry about optimization until much later in development, the problem is I don't know our limits, and I'm not a code wizard. Our game theoretically will require a lot of instances doing a lot of stuff, so if I can curb some of that burden sooner than later, there will be hopefully fewer restrictions down the line. So this was my plan. For the most part, ideally our building's functionality won't require that there are always active objects in the world, meaning we could possibly save on resources by maintaining object data without the object always being active. To do this, I went with a data grid because I still don't know how to properly handle clumps of data any other way. I then created a script that would run anytime a building object is created. This building object would pass on its ID to the data grid, and it would create a new entry for us to manage later on. I then drew this list to the side of the screen just to make sure everything was being recorded properly. While testing this, I actually ran into an issue. The script kept trying to write outside of the grid's boundaries, which is a little weird because it's not like I was doing anything different from any other time I've set up a data grid. Turns out, because I kept trying to resize the grid with every new entry, out of sheer habit I used the ++ instead of +1 to do so, which apparently was not applicable here. But with that error fixed, I was able to add new entries to the building data grid anytime a building object was added to the game. And so now I had to find a way to remove data from the grid whenever a building object is removed from the game. So I set up a variable that would check for the object's position in the grid and had it remove all its data. Because as I learned, once an entry has been made to the data grid, it can't be removed. So I had to get a little creative with how I handled that now vacant space. After removing data from the grid, I had the grid sort itself to group any and all vacant spaces at the bottom. Then in the creation script, I checked for vacant spaces, and if such a space existed, the new data would be placed there. This meant that the script would first check for a vacant space, and if it did not exist, only then would it expand the grid to add the new entry to the building list. And surprisingly, it worked. Well, kind of. While I was able to fill in vacant spaces, if all spaces were vacant, the script would ignore them all and add a new entry as if none of those spots actually existed. And believe me, I spent so much time trying to make this work. Nothing I tried was successful, and eventually I ran out of ideas. So I decided to take a break and do some research. I then came back to try a data list. Because list position wasn't important, perhaps the data grid was overkill. I learned that certain values could be isolated from data lists and modified through accessors, and it sounded like the answer to my problems. I managed to add object IDs and some extra random data for testing to the data list. However, deleting said data was where I met yet another wall. While I could isolate and find data, there didn't seem to be a way to completely remove an entry from the list. In other words, I couldn't tie object IDs to corresponding data because apparently that's not how it's handled. From what I understand, let's say two buildings share the same data value, say a resource of some kind. If I try to isolate one building's resource number and it matches another, GameMaker will modify both because there's no way to differentiate between them. In other words, almost another hour wasted and I was nowhere closer to an answer. In fact, I was even further away than before. So I took another break and started to review my footage from the first session. Maybe I overlooked something. Well, ladies and gentlemen, lo and behold, I did. Turns out I was on the right track before, I was just too flustered to realize it. Going back to our OData grid system, I restored everything to where we were pre-list attempt. I realized that because I sorted the grid with the vacant spots being listed at the end, all I had to do was resize the grid so that those entries exceeded the grid's limit. This would mean they technically no longer exist. So basically all I had to do was reverse the creation script. But instead of adding an entry, I would first remove the data, then restart the list so that the now vacant space was at the end, and finally snip it off by resizing the grid. In all, I spent over 2 hours trying to figure this issue out, and a first perspective, and 5 minutes was all it took to fix it. So to say I'm relieved would be an understatement, and I'm hopeful that this wasn't all in vain. But that is the beauty of programming. Sometimes you'll spend hours on something that doesn't even matter in the end. So for now, I decided to rest my sanity and ready myself for what's sure to be even tougher battles to come. Which brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our progress in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.